Welcome back to our video series for Church in the Round here at Westminster Presbyterian. This is week number 3, and our topic is engaging the Psalms as poets of the imagination. And Margaret and I are thrilled to welcome Wendy Brown-Báez, who is the Poet Laureate of Westminster, as she calls herself, or our Artist in Residence for the current year. And we are really thrilled that you are here in general for the year, but in particular to help us think about the Psalms as poetry. So I'll start because I have been accused sometimes of being overly analytical. What's poetry? What counts as poetry? What should we know? What does it mean to call the Psalms as poems? I mean, take us into that.
Great, that's a great question. That will lead us into the difference between poetry and prose.
Right.
So to set the tone, I have a couple of quotes I'd like to start with. One is from Christopher Fry, who says, "Poetry is a language in which man explores his own amazement." And then this one from Tyler Nutt Gregson, "Poetry is a way to take the ache and make it sing." And that really speaks to me. That's why I started writing poetry. Okay. You know, taking the ache and making it sing. And then thinking about Psalms, I thought, that Psalms are a way to take a prayer and make it sing.
And often that prayer is an ache. You know,
Yes.
I'm thinking about all of the Psalms of Lament, sometimes physical or spiritual or social.
And a longing. It's a longing. And then Ellen Bass is a very well-known poet. She's written a couple of books of poetry, and she teaches poetry classes. And she says, poetry is the practice of paying attention. It's the practice of being fully present in our lives, open to the beauty and the pain, the glorious and the wretched. Like prayer, poetry is a path to seeing the divine in the ordinary. Metaphor itself is a way of apprehending the similarities in seemingly unrelated things. All poetry had its roots in religion, as ritual for both celebration and lamentation. And poetry continues to ask the essential questions. Who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? So basically, poetry is musicality. It has rhythm, breath, pause, and silence. And that's the difference between poetry and prose. And all of that's included in the Psalms. That rhythm is partly the way that the poem is structured on the page, but nowadays contemporary poetry doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to follow any particular structure. It can be all over the place. I mean, there's blackout poems where you take a piece of prose and you black out all the words except the poetic words you want to rise to the surface. Yeah. So there's many, many ways to have poetry, but there has to be some sense of rhythm. And the poet helps the reader find that sense of rhythm, gives clues by how the poem is structured on the page. So the line breaks, for example, and the space between stanzas, those are all clues to where there's a pause or there's a breath or there's an emphasis. And the white around the words is the silence. Poetry is also distilled and distinctive language. Poetry uses metaphors and imagery to access emotion. And poetry is often repetition. So that might be lines, or that might be words, or it might be phrases, or we see in Psalms sometimes there's a whole line that's repeated throughout the Psalm. Right. And all of these apply to Psalms. So Psalms are definitely poetry by these definitions of poetry. But I also think that poetry is seeing things in a fresh way. It's a way to pay attention to the world around us and within us. And it's having an experience that shifts our understanding. Which, I mean, you could say almost any literature does or any kind of art form does. Anything that's artistic is going to shift our understanding. But poetry does it in a way that's very intuitive rather than logical. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the difference.
Yeah. Doesn't it slow us down too?
That's the
In
pause.
a deliberate,
yes,
meaningful way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you don't have to understand a poem to get something out of it.
That helps me. Good.
Yeah, it can move you or, shift you in some way without necessarily understanding exactly what every single line means.
Right. Like using words to get at something kind of pre-logical or something. That's, interesting.
Yes. Yeah, so I have a list of things that describe poetry. I'm just going to read it really quickly.
Yeah, please.
Poetry is a moment, a story, an observation, reflection, praise, or lamentation, a feeling, an insight, a reaction, a warning, a memory, raises questions. It's exploration, discovery, and playfulness. It can be a belief, a testimony, or witnessing, and envisioning. So that describes Psalms too.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That is a beautiful list. I started sparking examples as you were sort of going through that. Are you going to slow down with that for us at all? Are we going to get to pull out some of those?
I'm going to give you guys a handout that you can give to everyone.
Perfect.
They can take home and reflect on it.
Awesome.
Because so really it's everything.
Yeah.
It's every human experience, it's every human emotion, but with distilled language, like every word has to count.
Yeah.
Every word's important. Also, poetry is a moment of transformation in the reader. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between contemporary poetry and Psalms.
Right.
And this was interesting for me because I have read Psalms many times. There's Psalms that I love. There's Psalms that are very familiar to us. But there's some new things that came up for me in thinking about this topic. And first of all, I want to say that I agree with Ellen Bass that in ancient times, poetry, theater, music, and dance were all sacred ceremony to align ourselves to the divine and to the natural world. So what Psalms do is they align ourselves to the divine. They are prayer in that form. They're about a relationship. And what has struck me in reading through them again is a lot of them are love poems.
Matt was saying we should call this whole thing, the Older Testament, a love story. That's what we should call our year of adult education in the Older Testament. So sort of tease that out. How does love show up in the Psalms in particular?
Well, as you mentioned, a lot of times it's us longing for God, calling out for God, asking for God for help, for comfort, for assurance, and there is God answering. So this is what's different about Psalms than contemporary poetry, is there's an answer. There's a relationship. Yeah. And even some of the Psalms are so sensual, they're almost like Pablo Neruda, 21 poems of love and a poem of lamentation. It's that richness of calling out and longing for and being blessed in return. And then the other thing is that Psalms are really meant to be chanted or sung in the community as a collective experience. A lot of them were written by David, but I think their intention was this is something we do together. That alignment with the divine is something we're doing together as the Israeli people, the Jewish people.
Which is a good plug for weeks 4 and 5, where we're going to talk about singing and we're going to talk about corporate worship as well, right?
I had this image of David dancing before bringing the ark into the temple, him dancing and singing and that joy.
Yeah. No, it's a helpful invitation not to think of this as, you pull a journal of poetry from the shelf and sort of sit and contemplate by yourself. There is that. There is a solitary relationship to the Psalter, but there really is also this sort of collective imagining that happens as a community. Yeah,
I would say that, usually writing poetry is a solitary occupation. Often when you go to a poetry reading, you're being read to. Right. And except for, slam and spoken word, like that's a whole thing that's happened in the past 30 years where it's very interactive with the audience. But Psalms are really meant to be shared together. Yeah. I feel like sometimes you can even hear multiple voices within a single psalm. You'll sort of hear somebody calling the people to worship, and then you'll hear sort of one voice in the first person singular kind of testifying within it. So, they do seem to capture that kind of experience. Yeah, and then another thing is that I think it would be fabulous to have examples of the Psalms being read in Hebrew, because each Hebrew word has mystical significance. And so it creates an energy. It's a very powerful energy to read, more than one, like to read a number of Psalms in a row. You're creating this mystical, powerful energy.
What has your experience of reading the Psalms been?
Well, I've at one point I just gave myself a task of reading the whole Old Testament straight through.
Sure.
I think I was having that ache, wanting to know what is life about? What answers can I find by reading the Bible? But in particular, I know that there are moments of crisis where the Jewish people literally read aloud all of Psalms, all of them, one after the other, nonstop. And there was a time when I did that, when Menachem Begin was assassinated. Like, I didn't know what to do. I was so upset and in such deep grief. So that's what I did. I just opened the book and read each one by one through the whole series. I don't remember how long it took me.
Was it in one sitting you sat?
Mm-hmm. At one sitting. Yeah, you sit in one sitting.
That's a lot, because each is intense in and of itself. I sometimes find with Psalms, I might be able to sit and read the whole Gospel of Mark, to choose the shortest gospel, right, in one sitting. But the Psalms, each one, and the tone shifts among them and even within them so much. So what was that experience like, of experiencing them all in a row like that?
I think that what happens is, like I mentioned, there's this kind of power that builds. But the other thing I want to say about Psalms that's different from contemporary poetry is that there is many, many, many images of comfort, assurance, and they're uplifting. So contemporary poetry doesn't necessarily end in a way that feels comforting. I mean, they can end in a bittersweet way. They connect us with our grief. They can be provocative. They can be outraged. You can feel outraged. You can, raise questions. But Psalms, over and over and over, it is God is listening. God does love us. God is with us.
We've talked some, Margaret and I have, and some in some other classes at Westminster, about how the Psalms are a particular part of the Older Testament where you're prompted to speak about who God is, that so much of the rest of the Bible is third person. You're an observer watching other people hash it out or suffer or love. But the Psalms, just by the way they're written and perhaps by the way we encounter them in worship, pull us into giving voice ourselves about who God is. And sometimes, not exactly against our will, but they do prompt us and say, try this language on for size and see how it fits. Is that fair to say that that's part of the experience? And so then I have to say something like, I believe God is present, or I believe God is a secure a rock, a fortress, whatever metaphor.
Yeah, or even I believe you are, right? Psalms are poetry in the second person, so it's even more sort of forceful than that. Yeah. It's also that sense of sometimes when we're in lamentation, we need to be held. We can't do it by ourselves. And so having these words available to be the rock that we stand on can be really helpful.
Do you have advice on reading the Psalms as poetry? You talked about what kind of poetry they are. I mean, we could study things like parallelism and acrostics and all of that, but that doesn't come through in translation because we're reading material that's been written over 2,000 years ago in a very different culture. So it's not our native poetic tongue in many ways for anybody anymore. I mean, if you're Jewish in a way, but it still is coming from far beyond our ordinary. Is that fair to say? And so how do you read that respectfully, but also intelligently, understanding the difference, but also freely what did you use? You used language of, did you talk about freedom at one point earlier? You used a word that caught my attention about being more open, how these Psalms can open us up, I thought.
I don't know, but I would say, first of all, to do it slowly. there's some psalms that will speak to you more than others, and it's okay to just take your time with them, and not everything's going to be applicable. There's a lot of warrior language also in Psalms, and I have translated that in my own head in a metaphysical way. So the enemy within myself, my own negative thinking, or my separation from God, rather than please go slay my enemy.
There are some imprecatory psalms that are about the slaying of enemies. Yeah.
So I would say it's okay, just like any poetry, any poem that you read, there's lines that really resonate and some that do not. Yeah. So, take your time and sit with it. Read it over and over and over, not just one time and done, but read it again and see what comes up. And then I think it's okay to just choose certain verses that really are the most meaningful to you. Sure. And it, as a personal journey. Mm-hmm. I talked about how it's meant for the collective, but poetry is a personal journey also.
What does it mean to you that the Psalms are in the Bible? You talked about trying to read the Bible start to finish, and a lot of people give up in Leviticus or soon after.
Don't make it to Psalms, yeah.
Right, don't make it to Psalm. In other words, so much of the Bible is either narrative, or it's regulatory, or it's prophetic, it's more prose. Right. But Psalms, here you've got this big block of poetry. Why is it significant that that's, when we say the Bible, we're also talking about poetry?
Right. Well, poetry was the language of sacred ceremony. Mm-hmm. It is the language of transformation. It is the language of that prayerful alignment. It's personal and yet universal. And so I think that having the Psalms included is a way of providing a way for the individual to have their personal experience with the divine. Because so much of it is historical. It's, the part of the identity, but Psalms is, you're under your talit, right? You're under your prayer shawl. You're alone with God in community.
Right.
What is there that delights you in the Psalms? Are there any particular images or turns of phrase or things that you really enjoy about them?
Yes.
Or within them?
Yes. There's a couple that really, really speak to me. I love Psalm 133.
Okay.
How good and pleasant it is. Yeah. In fact, if I could read it, it's really short.
Yeah, that would be
that
great.
One. How good and pleasant it is when God's people dwell together in unity. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe. It is as if the dew of Hermon were falling on Mount Zion. For there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore. And I love that image of the oil, the sensualness of the oil pouring down, that anointing, that special anointing. You can just, feel it, like the olive oil in the desert. You can feel that oil, right? Yeah. And but the other one that's one of my very, very favorites is Psalm 63. So I had mentioned about love poems, Neruda. This really reminds me of Neruda. And I'll just read a couple lines. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water.
That's another one with that image of, and in some ways that's almost an opposite image to the overabundance of oil, right? This is one that's based in this sort of parched lack of water. Oh, those are beautiful.
So one thing that we're doing in the curriculum that the people in the small groups are looking at are some optional exercises you can do during the week. Yes. And one of those for this week is to write your own psalm.
Yes, yes.
So if you were to give, a 30-second pep talk,
yes.
How do you write your own psalm?
Okay. Yes.
And it could be technical or it can be the mindset, whatever.
Yeah.
What
I
would
have
you tell
3
people?
steps.
Perfect.
3 steps to
You
write
have
a
more than
psalm.
30 seconds then.
Begin by addressing God in a personal way. So Psalms talk about God the Father, God the Creator, God the Rock. But you could also say, God who is my strength, God who I turn to in times of stress, God who knows me and knows my heart. Something that's your personal relationship to God. So start there. And then think of what you love and what you want to protect and be specific. Poetry uses really specific imagery. So the faces of my loved ones around the table. Then also think about something you want help to care for. And that also can be really specific. You can make a list, but you don't want to necessarily add all of them to the psalm. So it might be the ecosystem. It might be the people of the Holy Land. It might be those who are ill or grieving. And then choose an abstract quality. Add in an abstract quality: freedom, harmony, peace, well-being. And then end with an affirmation. To make it really feel like a psalm, end with something that's really uplifting and joyous. So the mountains will break into song. The tears will be changed into laughter. The bride and the bridegroom will rejoice. That kind of language, which is copied really right from the Psalms. Yeah. But that's it. That's the 3 steps.
Well, other biblical authors copy it from the Psalms too and reuse it. It's also worth noting. Right. Never waste a good metaphor.
Yes. Right. And another thing I think to mention is that Jesus knew the Psalms. I mean, he quotes from the Psalms. So that's another reason to read the Psalms, to know the Psalms. I mean, it's a way into the culture and the lifestyle and who he was.
Yeah. This is great. We could go on and on. But I'm thank you so much for bringing not just your own knowledge as a poet, but your own experience with the Psalms and telling us some of the Psalms you love and helping us figure out how to write them as well. So we really appreciate your presence here at Westminster and especially in this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.